Welcome to Advantage. I'm your host, David Young, and today we're going to take a little continued look. We're going to do a part two on our conversation that started last week, taking a look at walkthrough observations. Now, I put a little caveat on the episode to start. I've been trying to keep these episodes around 20 to 25 minutes. This one's going to be just a little bit longer than that, not a lot, but just a little bit. So I hope you'll stick with me. It truly is packed with information that I believe and I hope will be helpful to you. So before we get started today, though, I want to give you a couple shout outs. Most folks, not all, but most folks that listen to Advantage are in a leadership position: teacher leader, assistant principal, principal, district leader. And so first of all, I want to thank you. I got a lot of positive feedback this week on some of the episodes that I've been doing lately. And so I just really appreciate that. So thank you for that feedback. And I got a few questions as well. And I always enjoy getting those also. So thank you for listening to the podcast or watching on YouTube. Second, though, I want to give you a shout out for a couple things that happened this week that just reminded me how important school and district leaders are. You know, so let me preface it by saying I've had a busy week, one of the busier weeks that I really have had in a while. I had a staff meeting this week. I had a board meeting with all of my superintendents, and we had our commissioner of education was there as well, followed by last night a town hall meeting where we had, almost 100 people from the community who came to that. Today, I had a meeting with instructional supervisors from across the Central Kentucky region, and then I'm wrapping it up tomorrow with an all-day school visit at one of our high schools. So I just wanted to let you know, as I have had all of those interactions with different people who work in education. Oh, by the way, I also had a bunch of conversations with legislators who work for the General Assembly, our elected officials this week. And in so many of those conversations, it just keeps coming up how important having really good school principals and assistant principals and other leaders, and how good having strong superintendents and instructional supervisors and DPPs and other um, district administrators. It just kept coming up how important you are. So I just want to give you a shout out for that. But that wasn't the only thing that happened. The other thing that happened was OEA. And if you're inside Kentucky, you may have heard of OEA, but if you're outside of Kentucky, you might have not. OEA is stands for the Office of Education Accountability, and it's sort of an arm of the legislature. And the reason that it exists is to monitor schools and hold schools accountable and districts accountable for following the law, but also to dig in and do research whenever the legislature wants research to be done. Well, so they had asked OEA about a year ago to do a research study on um, the high impact schools, academically high impact schools, so high performing schools uh, in the state, and what common characteristics they have, and the lowest impact schools or low performing schools in the state, and what impact, or I'm sorry, what common characteristics they have, and then what are the differences between the two. And they presented that uh, to the Senate Committee on Education, and I was able to watch that meeting after the fact. And they did a really nice job with that study. They started out by taking districts. They didn't necessarily study a district that was high performing if it was really affluent, had a lot of wealth in that community, and not a lot of economic barriers or social barriers maybe that were being faced in that community. Not to take anything away from those schools and districts, but that's just not who they used for the study. They looked at the highest performing schools, and then they also factored in if they had some other barriers like a relatively high free and reduced lunch rate or high rate of maybe some more disadvantaged subgroups, or if they maybe students with disabilities. They looked at all that, and so what they did is as they presented their findings, they tried to really distill it down to just a few characteristics, common characteristics of high performing schools and common characteristics of low performing schools. And I may do a whole episode on it at some point because it was really fascinating. But I want to point one thing out that really stood out. Again, they only had a few like key characteristics, and it wasn't any surprise to me. But one of those key characteristics that the high impact schools had was that they all had strong, knowledgeable school and in many cases district leaders who were in administrative roles and other roles. But it even went a little bit deeper than that, and this was really interesting. I wanted to share it with you today. They mentioned that they were a little bit surprised by this. What they found was there was a knowledge gap between what was known in the high performing schools by the leadership and by the teachers, like knowing what it was that is supposed to be happening. There was a knowledge gap between the high performing schools and the low performing schools, but it wasn't nearly as great as they thought that it would be. What was the big differentiator wasn't knowing what to do, it was actually knowing how to do the things that needed to be done. It was they even used the phrase, they said it really stuck out to us that implementation is really hard. And so the difference, the biggest difference was not knowing the best practices and what needed to be done. The biggest practice was the high performing schools had leaders who knew how to put those things in place. And so I thought that was a big takeaway. And the message is this: as a school or district leader, gosh, it's a big responsibility, but the potential is so great for you to do such good things. Like you really have the power within your grasp to make your school or make your district a high impact, high performing school or district. And that really benefits a ton of kids and their families and the community as a whole. So, the work that you do is extremely important. And I just want to give you a shout out for doing it. Thank you for doing what you do. So that brings us then, and I want to say, practical strategies for implementing is really where it's at. I don't want to go past this, and that makes me really happy because that's what I try to do here on Advantage is to teach some things, but also give you some practical strategies for implementing those. And so I hopefully I'm on target with that. And again, thank you for listening, and I enjoyed getting that feedback this week, and I want to give you kudos for being for having. I want to impress on you the opportunity that you have there in your schools and in your district. So sorry to ramble there, but that brings us to today. So last week we started talking about classroom walkthrough observations. And so I want to do a quick review. I won't spend too much time on it, but a quick review of that. We said number one, that classroom walkthrough observations are maybe the key vehicle to you getting the agreements that your school has. Remember, we talked about identifying your superstar teachers and trying to get as many other teachers as you could to look and act and behave like your superstar teachers. And step one was to come together with some agreements on how we're going to do business in the classroom, what good classroom instruction is going to look like, and how we're going to operate as a school. So, walkthrough observations are probably the number one way for you to monitor and make sure that those things are happening in all of your classrooms. We also said classroom walkthrough observations need to be unannounced. Now, they aren't meant to be a gotcha, like I'm popping in to try to catch you when you aren't doing your job well. They're meant for feedback and coaching, So positive feedback and some constructive feedback to help our teachers grow. So in your school, if you aren't doing a lot of walkthroughs and you start doing them, you know, you may have some teachers who feel like it's a gotcha on the beginning. And if you have teachers who feel like that, I just encourage you to just keep at it. The more you get into their classrooms and the more um, it's not a scary experience for them, the more you're giving them some positive feedback, but also some constructive feedback. And then you're just in there a lot, the less it feels like a gotcha. And you'll eventually be able to kind of change that mindset and turn the tide in your school. Um, we also talked about classroom walkthroughs have a lot of different purposes beyond just making sure that those agreements were being implemented and helping your teachers grow. They also increase your visibility. As a byproduct of that, they make your building safer. They help with behavior management. They give you a better perspective. If a parent has a concern or a complaint about a teacher or another person in your building, you have a much different or much better perspective on that. They create communication avenues and opportunities for for you to talk with your staff and your staff to talk with you and your staff to talk with each other even. And they also make you more knowledgeable when you're meeting with building administration and they want or district administration and they want to know how things are going in your building. You have a better pulse on what's happening, a better finger on the pulse for what's happening in your school. So those classroom walkthrough observations really serve a lot of purposes. The other thing we talked about last week was we talked about two different kinds of walkthroughs. So it's good that you're doing them, but there really are two different kinds. And one is what I call snapshot walkthroughs, and the other is teacher growth walkthroughs. And what last week's episode was about, what this week's episode is about, is not the snapshots, but about the teacher growth walkthroughs, which need to be the overwhelming majority of the walkthroughs that you do. The snapshot walkthroughs do have a purpose, a real targeted purpose, but the bulk need to be teacher growth walkthroughs in order for you to really improve what's happening in your school. So if you haven't gotten to listen to last week's episode about those two different kinds, I encourage you to go back and take a listen to that. So today we're going to build off what we learned last week and we're going to wrap up our conversation about walkthroughs by answering three questions. Number one, what kind of feedback should you leave as you're coaching your teachers during walkthrough observations? So, what should the feedback look like? What should you say? What should the tone be that you're using in different situations? We're going to get into all that. And then number two and number three sort of go together. I'm going to pull them together today. Number two is uh, if walkthroughs are the number one way for you to make sure your agreements are being implemented, what even needs to be on those agreements? We've been talking about them for a few weeks and I've given you a few examples, but I'm going to make some real specific suggestions today for what should be in your agreements. And then that gets to question three. When you enter a classroom, what should you be looking for? And you should be looking for elements of those agreements. But in what order? What should you look for first, second, third, fourth, fifth? Um, and then how do all those things connect together? So I'm going to give you some suggestions on what you should be looking for, which means things that should be in the agreements. What order should you be looking for them in, and how do they connect? So first, let's start with question one about feedback. When you enter a classroom doing a teacher growth walkthrough, first of all, you don't need to be looking for 30, 40, 50 things. That's a snapshot walkthrough. Those are meant to be done in bulk, and I won't get into all that again. But you don't need to go in a teacher growth walkthrough looking for a big, broad span of things. You need to be looking for a specific um, kind of a narrow set of things that, again, align with your agreements. So, in a minute, again, I'm going to make some suggestions on what should be, you know, what should be in those agreements, what should be those look fors. But I want to ask you to keep this in mind first. If you go into classrooms and you're only looking for a small number of things, not 30, 40, 50 things, And those things are based on your agreements, which the teacher in the classroom already knows about. He or she, they were a part of developing those agreements and kind of approving those. So they've been a part of that process. So you're only looking for a few things, and those things come from the agreements. What you're doing is you're setting your coaching up to be more focused, to be more specific, and it's coaching that your teacher, it's not going to be overwhelming. The teacher's going to be able to wrap his or her mind around that and be able to take action that leads to improvement. So when you give feedback, I want to encourage you to resist the urge to comment on every single thing that you see. Only comment on the things that you see that are coming from those agreements, just that narrow set of things that you're looking for. Now, I'll put a caveat on it. If you see other things that are beyond your agreements, but they're good. It's okay for you to leave some positive side notes about, outside the agreements, I saw this was going on and this was going on. And that's a really great job. So make sure if you do leave those things that they're positive, unless there's a safety concern, of course. If there's a safety concern, you definitely need to address that. But outside something extreme like that, make sure that you focus on the agreements, and only if you leave anything outside those agreements, keep those comments few, and make sure that they're positive. So the tone of your feedback, let's talk about that, because that's really important as well. Well, if you see the teacher attempting to implement the agreements, first of all, you should brag on that, even if they aren't doing it well. If they're attempting, you can tell if they're giving effort and they're planning and they're trying to do it. You should definitely give them positive feedback and brag on them for that. If they're doing it well, or if they're doing it a lot better than they were the last time you saw them, you need to brag on that. Brag on them some more, give them some more positive feedback. It's important when we see people who work for us doing things well, it's important that we, number one, praise them for it, but number two, give them really specific praise for a couple reasons. Number one, it lets them know that they're doing a really good job, and it's important, or that we see that they're giving great effort. And it's important just to give people an attaboy or an attagirl for those things. But when you give specific feedback, you start to build consciously competent teachers. So I'm going to say that phrase again: consciously competent. That means they are becoming really competent, um, successful, proficient level teachers, and they're conscious about it. Like they're not only good, they can articulate why they're good. And the more you create consciously competent people in your organization, the more those people are able to help other people um, become better, help them improve in the future. So specific feedback and positive feedback is really important. So on the flip side of the coin, though, what if you get in there and the teacher's working hard, but he or she is failing? They're not doing well. Well, again, if the teacher's giving effort to implement the agreements but just not doing a very good job, you do need to handle that kind of delicately. Here's what I would recommend. I would recommend the following steps. Number one, you still need to brag on the effort. You still need to give them an attaboy or an attagirl for trying hard. That is really important. Number two, though, when it gets into the things that are failing, my recommendation is that you just write down a very factual play by play of what's happening without judgment. You're just writing down that, this student was calling out, this student was up and moving around the room. As I saw the content, I'm not sure what was happening in the class was congruent or aligned to what the intent of the lesson was. But you're trying to be as factual and non judgmental as you can in your writing. As you get to the end of the walkthrough form, you want to say something like, "Hey, I, after watching today, I've got a couple questions that I want to run by you. So whenever you get a chance later today, don't stress, but when you get a chance, come see me, give me a call, text me, and I'll come down and pop in and talk to you for a few minutes. And then when that happens later on in the day, you need to deliver the constructive criticism, but do it verbally instead of um, in writing. The reason, and constructive criticism, you can, in that verbal conversation, you can also get the teacher's feedback and find out where their mind was as they were teaching or as they were planning, and then you can provide the coaching that they need. But the constructive criticism happens verbally, not in writing. The reason I recommend the process like that is that I believe when you put things in writing, it's heavy. It has a lot of weight, and that can be positive weight or negative weight. I can remember as a principal when I would leave positive feedback for my teachers, and like literally handwritten positives. I might come back in the next week and they might have that hanging up on their file cabinet near their desk or on the wall, kind of like we put our kids' good work up on our refrigerator. It matters to them. So on the flip side, when you leave really negative feedback, it's not just on the paper, like it's kind of burned into the paper. And so if you have a teacher who's really given a lot of effort and trying, instead of burning that criticism into the paper, much better to have that conversation verbally, because as you're talking with somebody, you can kind of control the tone, you can control the wording that you're using, you can be a little more strict and heavy if you need to be, but you can also be a little softer and light if you need to be. And the only way to do that is to have a verbal conversation. You can't do that in an email, you can't do that in a text, and you can't do that on a walkthrough form. So it's really important that is the teacher giving effort and trying. Now, so what's the other scenario? The other scenario is the teacher is not giving great effort and they're failing. So if you're in that situation, you know, it's okay to consider leaving the criticism or the construct, even if it still needs to be constructive criticism, but it's okay to leave it in writing. You just need to be aware of the weight of it. I used to ask myself before I left something real negative like that, even if the teacher wasn't uh, giving great effort. I used to ask myself, what I'm getting ready to write on this paper, would I be comfortable using that during the teacher's like official evaluation? And if I would, then sometimes I went ahead and wrote it. But if I was iffy on that and not really sure that I would want to use that comment that I was about to make in the evaluation meeting, sometimes I would kind of back up and handle it like the teacher that I mentioned before, where I would say, "Hey, give me a call later. Got something I want to run by you or ask you about your lesson," and then I would have that conversation with them verbally instead. So that gets us kind of through feedback. So now we're to those last two questions. The first one was what should be in the agreements, and then the second one is when you walk into a classroom, what should you look for? And again, you should look for the things in the agreements. I'm going to make some suggestions there. But what should you look for in priority order? First, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then how do those things connect together? So I'm going to try to address those together at the same time. But before I do, I want to make a suggestion to you. I want to give you a mindset. I want to give you an idea about maybe a different mindset. I want you to think about the fact that in many ways, a classroom walkthrough observation is just a quality control measure. Uh, Great organizations know how they want things done, whether those are schools or hospitals or factories or other businesses. The ones that are really successful, they know how they want things done, and then they have quality control measures in place to make sure that those things are being done at the highest level. So when you go into a classroom, that's really what you're doing, especially if you have the agreements already. You're just going into quality control, how well those agreements are being implemented in every classroom across your building. And if they aren't, you're trying to address that in a quality control way to get them implemented at a higher level. So, with that in mind, I'm going to present this to you in a kind of a step by step quality control protocol. Um, and it might help if you think about it. This is the way I think about it. It might help if you think about it as if I had a GoPro camera on my head and I'm getting ready to walk into the classroom and you're watching what I'm saying to you through the lens of that GoPro camera. So I'm going to try to focus on the things in order, one at a time, and then connect them as our walkthrough observation continues. So I'll put my GoPro camera on my head, and we're about to walk into the classroom. So when you walk in, the first thing that you should look for is a learning target or a minimum of two learning targets that should be driving the lesson. Now, we could do a whole other episode on learning targets versus standards, but bite sized learning targets that are pulled directly from your standards and that drive your lessons, that should be part of your agreements. It should be, we should agree that we're going to use bite sized learning targets from our standards to drive our lessons. Um, as you're in the classroom, the learning target or two, however many, I wouldn't go really much past two, but should be visible to the students. You should be able to see it. The students should be able to see it. And then you should ask yourself, does this look like a learning target? Does it look like it came directly from our standards or did it come from somewhere else? So, where else could it come from? Well, the teacher could have written that learning target off the top of his or her head. It could have come from somewhere online, a free lesson. Could have come from Teachers Pay Teachers. It could have come from a textbook or another resource that the teacher is using. But the key is here, it shouldn't come from any of those other sources. That learning target should come from the standards that the state standards or whatever that need to be taught for that grade level in that subject. So the first thing is you need to look for a learning target, see if you can find it. Is it visible? And did it come from your standards? Second, you need to look to see, is there a formative assessment, what I would typically call an exit slip, that the students are going to be completing at the end of the lesson. Um, Formative assessment, or again, an exit slip at the end of each daily lesson, should be part of your agreements. All of your classrooms should have that. Now, to go another step further, for the highest level of student success, I believe the exit slip should have 3 to 5 questions on it that are perfectly congruent, which means aligned to the learning targets that are driving the lesson today. You need to pay close attention to the verb in the target and make sure that the questions on the assessment, the formative assessment, are requiring the students to demonstrate their learning at the level of that verb. So, for instance, if the learning target's verb is analyze, then the questions on the formative assessment or the exit slip should be requiring kids to analyze. That sounds like a very simple thing, but that's often a place where we miss the mark, where the verb is analyzed, but what we're actually asking kids to demonstrate their learning through that we're having them perform at a lower level verb like list or identify or even explain is a lower level verb than analyze. So I want to note to you, we've gone in, we've looked for two things, and I want to note that if you have seen those two things, the teacher is doing an awfully nice job. I mean, you've seen where the lesson's going to start with the learning targets, and you've seen where the lesson's going to end with that exit slip, and those two things are perfectly aligned. So that's really good. So far, so good. And if you haven't seen those things, then you know the feedback that you need to leave the teacher. The third thing you need to look for is evidence of spiral review. Daily spiral review should be part of your agreements. Now, spiral review in your agreements and what you're looking for is not a review of yesterday's content. It's not even a review of what the teacher's been working on this week. This spiral review needs to be the teacher systematically reviewing content that was taught in previous units. So you need to look, and then it doesn't need to just happen once. In this review of these previous units needs to be systematically reviewed on a continuous repeated cycle throughout the year. So after unit one is taught early in the year, there needs to be a plan for when questions from unit one are going to show up in daily lessons throughout the rest of the year periodically. And then, of course, after unit two's taught and unit three and unit four, all those things kind of become questions from those units become part of the spiral review plan. So as we're in the classroom now and with the GoPro camera on my head, we're looking around. Do I see any evidence of spiral review? Do I see anything on the board, or do I see anything in the teacher's lesson plans? Do I see anything in some student work that they've done? I'm looking for evidence that there was spiral review used today. So now the fourth thing, now that we've done those three, the fourth thing is now we're in the middle of the lesson. Now you need to look at the resources that the teacher is using and that the students are utilizing. You need to look at the verbal questions being asked, and you need to look at the activities the students are participating in. And you're just asking yourself, are those activities and those questions and those resources, are they perfectly congruent or aligned to the learning target or two that are driving the lesson? So it's important that what's happening in the middle of the lesson, including questions and resources and hands-on materials, all that stuff, what's happening in the middle, what the students are doing, the work they're doing, it's important that those things are perfectly aligned. Now, I'll put a caveat on it. If they aren't perfectly aligned, it's possible that all is not lost, because sometimes the students that are not ready to perform at the level, in fact, often the students are not ready to perform at the level of the learning target driving the lesson at the beginning of the lesson. The teacher has to meet them where they are and scaffold up. So if you see that those resources and materials and questions aren't aligned, you need to ask yourself, is it logical within this class period that the teacher and that the students are going to be ready to perform at the level of that verb? And particularly if you see that the exit slip is aligned, that's a pretty good indication that the teacher feels like she can get them to the level of the learning target by the end of the lesson. But that's a big look for us, what's happening in the middle or the meat of the lesson. The next thing, this is the second to last thing. The next thing you need to look for now is you need to look at student engagement. In a lesson, of course, students should never be disengaged, but they also shouldn't be just passively engaged for more than 1 minute per their year of age. So, for example, third graders are 8 years old, about, and so there shouldn't be any segments of the lesson that are longer than 8 minutes where the students are just passively engaged, meaning they're just basically sitting and listening. Now, of course, that has an impact on a teacher's ability to, I'll say it, put in air quotes, to lecture. And we've all been guilty of lecturing for too long. It's really important, when the teacher's lecturing, the kids are either are hopefully not disengaged, but they're probably passively engaged. And the teacher does not need to lecture past that 1 minute per year of age. Once the teacher gets there, he or she needs to stop and actively engage the students. So that's what you're looking for. And if you're in that third grade classroom and the kids are 8 years old, that means in your walkthrough, you have to stay longer than 8 minutes, because you have to see, are the kids going to go from being passively engaged to actively engaged? And then we're at the last thing now. So then the last thing is, and by the way, your agreements, of course, need to say that we will actively engage our students in each daily lesson. Then the last thing you're looking for, your agreements should include that daily lessons will have guided practice and modeling as part of the teaching process. And guided practice and modeling are sometimes kind of a lost art, I believe, in education, and they're so important. Those things happen really well when the teacher is moving from passive engagement to active engagement. It's a great time then to check for the student's understanding, to do some modeling, to do some guided practice with them, maybe to do some cooperative learning or to do some hands-on practice. So that segment of the lesson, it's really important that those things exist, and you want to coach your teachers to look for opportunities to do modeling and guided practice and checks for understanding and cooperative learning and hands-on, for them to do those things in those moments when the students have been passively engaged for a while, and now it's time for them to be actively engaged, but actively engaged in a way that is perfectly aligned with what our learning targets are for today, and is moving the students toward being able to demonstrate their learning at the level of the learning target on the exit slip or formative assessment at the end of the lesson. So at that point, once I have seen those things and given the teacher feedback, I am finished with my walkthrough and I'm ready to walk on out. As I said last week, that's typically going to take you about 15 minutes, 10 to 15. So I would kind of plan around that. It's possible that it could be a little shorter than that if you see all those things pretty quickly. But typically, plan on about a 10 or 15-minute teacher growth walkthrough. So those are the key elements that I would suggest that are in your agreements, and then that I for daily lessons. And those are the elements that I would look for when that I would coach you to do when you're doing walkthrough classroom observations. Now, there probably will be other things in your agreements, not a bunch more, but I would specifically encourage you to have some other things in your agreements about how you're going to build standards into units of study with pacing guides and common unit assessments, and we may cover that in another episode one day. There's a systematic way to do that that's really effective. But for today, I just want to talk to you about the agreements that go specifically with what should be happening in a daily lesson in a classroom, and how you can use walkthrough observations to look for those and to quality control those and to help your teachers grow. You know, teacher growth walkthroughs, they're a huge part of building a high performing school. The fact that you not only do a lot of those teacher growth walkthroughs, but if you can do them well and do them like we have described today, it will make a huge difference in your school and in the educational attainment, and really just in the lives of your students. And that, of course, as we've said many times before, that has a ripple effect on their families and the community as a whole. And you have a lot of power to positively impact the students in your school and your staff. And I appreciate the fact that you're willing to do it. So that's all for today. As always, I want to remind you, remember to follow, like, and rate Advantage on Spotify and Apple. Remember to do those same things, and then I hope you'll consider subscribing to the YouTube channel Advantage with David Young, and also make sure to let me know if you have questions. If you want to put things in the comments, I'm getting better and better about checking those and giving some feedback. But also feel free to reach out to me by email or in other ways. I'd love to hear from you, to hear what you've learned from the podcast, maybe that's helping, and to answer any questions that you have. So, with that, I hope you have a great week. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time. Take care.